All right, looks like we have pretty much critical mass here, so we can go ahead and get started. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining today. I know it's a really busy week. I'm Nora Zaharsky, the press secretary for C2ES, and we are going to talk about COP28 today and what to expect. So we're going to start with some comments from our president, Nat Cohen, and he's an economist, more than 20 years of energy and environmental policy experience. Before coming to C2S 2 years ago, he was the senior vice president for climate with EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, and he led their research and policy advocacy on climate change in the US and globally. And in 2011 to 2012, he also served in the White House as special assistant to the president for energy and environment in the National Economic Council and Domestic Policy Council, helping to shape administration policy on energy and environmental issues. And then after Nat's remarks, we'll hear from C2ES Vice President for International Strategies, Kaveh Gilampour, and he's going to offer some insights on the global stocktake and what to expect at COP28. Kaveh joined us in 2021, coming our way from the UN, and he also has over more than 20 years working in environmental and climate change issues. And he's had various roles, including the legal advisor on the UK and EU's climate change negotiating teams, the UK's head of the UNFCCC negotiations, lead negotiator on climate change for the EU, and a lead negotiator for climate change on the Alliance of Small Island States and the Secretariat of High Ambition Coalition. So very excited to be able to share his thoughts with you today. And then before I turn things over to Nat, just a couple of points for housekeeping. This session is recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel later today. So I'll be sure to send out a link as soon as it's available to you all. Following Nat and Kaveh's comments, we'll open things up to questions. And to ask a question, please just raise your virtual Zoom hand. And then I know everyone's sick of hearing this, but please keep your mics muted to avoid any unnecessary background noise. And then just a final note for me, Nat and Kaveh will both be in Dubai for COP. So please keep in touch with us as you're looking for a quick reaction or explanations for what's happening on the ground. You can reach me anytime and I'll drop my email and cell in the chat. So with that, Nat, I'll hand it to you.
Thanks very much, Nora. And thanks everybody for joining. I see some old friends on the call as well as some new ones. So as Nora said, I'm Nat Cohen, the president of C2ES. I'm going to give some very quick opening framing remarks and then turn it to Kaveh, and then Kaveh will turn it back to me to talk a little bit about the U.S. perspective and how we think about the U.S. positioning going into the COP. But right up front, really what I just want to say in addition to welcome is, I think you all know C2ES, but just for those who don't, or to remind you, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. We were started as the Pew Center on Climate Change in 1998, and I think we bring two distinctive things to this conversation. The first is a long history of working directly in the UN negotiations. We've been supporting ongoing dialogues at the level of senior climate negotiators, the heads of delegation. We've been doing several of those HODS convenings, as we call them, several of them a year for about 15 years or so. They were instrumental in the creation of the Paris Agreement. They were instrumental in the development of the rule book, and they've continued to be really useful. And we use those as ways of helping to identify consensus and build consensus among negotiators. So that gives us, I think, a really key insight into the dynamics of the negotiations and what to expect at COP. And then in addition, of course, as many of you know as well, we work in the US on US federal policy. And so we're also quite, plugged in, I think, to the what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the development of things like the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and IIJA, which I will come back to when I cover those things in my comments. But with that brief framing, let me turn it over to Kaveh to walk us through what to expect from COP28. Kaveh, over to you.
Thanks, Nora. And Nora, if you could put the slides up again, that would be great. Brilliant. So what I'd like to do is really just go through a number of issues briefly and try to leave as much time for Q&A. I'm going to touch briefly on the COP28 presidency vision for COP28, talk about the first global stocktake and in particular the energy transition, talk a little bit around loss and damage and funding arrangements, adopting a global goal on adaptation, briefly touch potentially on non-party stakeholder accountability and also the action agenda at COP28. So next slide, please. So as some of you will be aware, the COP presidency has issued 3 letters this year that progressively sort of refine their vision for what they think that COP28 should be about. The first of these was released in around July, the second in October, and the third during this month. So essentially, they've put the COP into 4 overarching buckets. One is the just energy transition. The other is transforming climate finance. The third, they have labeled nature, people, lives and livelihoods and putting those at the center of climate action. And the fourth is mobilizing for an inclusive COP. So that's essentially the framing that the presidency has put on the table for this COP. Next slide, please. So I'd like to focus in particular on this issue, the first global stocktake and accelerating the energy transition. So as you will be aware, the Paris Agreement has at its beating heart a 5-year ambition cycle, and the center of that is the what's known as the global stocktake. That started at COP26 in Glasgow and will conclude at COP28, and that has essentially 2 mandates. One is to inform countries as to how to raise their ambition when they come forward with new climate targets, which are due in 2025. And the second part of the mandate of the global stocktake is to enhance international cooperation. So those are the 2 main things that the global stocktake is supposed to do. But to add real value, and CGS has worked for over 2 years on a deep dive looking into the value of the global stocktake and how it could be most effective. And the results of that work indicate that to add real value, COP28 and the global stocktake need to identify a limited number of key, specific, operational and transformative signals. And the one that really has the biggest momentum going into COP28, and which is at the heart of the presidency vision for a just energy transition, is this notion of tripling global renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. So that's really got a lot of momentum going into the COP. It was in the US-China statement recently that Nat will talk about. It's also in a pledge that the COP28 presidency, EU and others have signed up to. And I understand that it's close to 100 countries that have signed that pledge so far. We think it has to land specifically in the formal outcome of the global stocktake in a decision to be taken at the COP. Of course, there's also this issue about whether to phase down or phase out unabated fossil fuels. The presidency, in its vision, has talked about imagining a world free of unabated fossil fuels by 2050, and also refers to phase down of fossil fuels. But the other element that's really going to be critical is that COP28 needs to set out a clear plan for what's going to happen next, and link those high-level signals, such as a renewable energy target, to the process of submitting new climate targets in 2025, or nationally determined contributions as they're known. Next slide. So aside from the global stocktake and the energy transition, you will be aware that in COP27, history was made by adopting new funding arrangements and also a fund for loss and damage. A transitional committee was established to take forward that work and essentially consider how that fund could be operationalized. That committee met 4 times and then again for a 5th time recently in Abu Dhabi, and has put forward clean text and a clean proposal for adoption at COP28. That still needs the agreement of all 197 or so parties. But the good news is that there is a clean proposal going into the COP. This issue could be politically charged and it could affect the mood at COP28. But as I say, it's good news that we go into the COP with a clean proposal that was agreed by the Transitional Committee. Next slide, please. Aside from the global stocktake, the energy transition and loss and damage, COP28 is due to adopt a framework on the global goal on adaptation. Now, the issue here is that the Paris Agreement established a global goal to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability, but it really lacked some of the detail that we see, for example, in terms of the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, which has as guiding stars the 1.5 degree limit, net zero by 2050, those sort of aspects which are kind of missing from the adaptation piece. So COP26 launched a process which is due to conclude at COP28 to further define that goal. And this is the framework that's due to be adopted. Again, failing to agree that would be not good news for the COP, but I'm quite optimistic that something will be agreed. CGS has done a lot of work on what a salient politically motivated guiding star goal for adaptation could be. And again, I think Nora can share some of those resources with you at the end, but that's a paper worth looking at. What could that guiding star for adaptation be, and could COP28 land that? It would be very important. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the presidency has these 4 areas that it's focusing on, and in particular, it's putting a lot of focus, as every COP since the Paris Agreement was adopted has progressively focused more and more on the action agenda. So these are the events that are focused not only on parties, countries participating, but also the very large number of non-parties that will be attending the COP. And I think this COP is expected to have a record number of something like 70,000 participants, at least half of whom are not going to be directly involved in the negotiations, but will be involved in the action agenda. So aside from the World Climate Action Summit, where world leaders are expected to attend, there's a number of thematic days throughout the COP, such as health, finance, energy, nature, food, youth. So you can expect to see a lot of focus on those areas going through the COP. Next slide, please. So aside from supporting the heads of delegation at the negotiations, and also working with the private sector, there's a number of events that we will be involved in co-hosting, more than a dozen of them, in fact, including a panel on how US policy is accelerating business investment, an official UNFCCC side event on the global stocktake, another one, again, looking at resilience and adaptation, and a number of others. Again, we can share our COP28 page with you after this, where you can find details of that. So with that, I'd like to hand over back to Nat, and of course, I'm happy to also take questions at the end. Nat, back to you.
Thanks, Kaveh. So as discussed, I wanted to touch on a couple of things. Actually, even before I go to the US, I'll look at this bottom. You see the bottom point here about the Energy Transition Accelerator and voluntary carbon markets. Let me touch on that, which is sort of in the international world, but also distinct, of course, from the UNFCCC negotiations that Kaveh reviewed. I think this will be I think we will see several things at this COP around the voluntary carbon market. It's been a year of turmoil, in a sense, for the VCM. There's lots of questions that have been raised about the current approach and the integrity of projects that are underway. I'm sure all of you have seen that, and some of you have contributed to that. And as a result, or I think efforts that have been in the works for some time are focused on a couple of things. One is really ensuring the integrity of the voluntary carbon market, both in terms of the quality of credits and in terms of how those credits are used by companies. And then secondly, thinking about new and innovative approaches that can scale up finance and use voluntary carbon markets as a means of scaling significant finance into emissions reductions and green growth in the global South, and do so with integrity. And so just to touch on those briefly, in the first bucket, the integrity piece, I think we will see, we expect the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, to come out next week with an updated set of its claims guidance for companies in terms of how to use credits towards their voluntary climate commitments. And I think we'll see that introducing a bit more flexibility into the ways that companies can use claims towards meeting their commitments around net zero, or they're making progress towards meeting net zero targets. And that kind of flexibility, I think, will be really welcome, along with the guardrails that VCMI will put into place. And then the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is working on the supply side of credits, came out back in July with its core carbon principles and assessment framework for assessing carbon crediting programs and carbon crediting methodologies or types of credits. And I think we will see some continued, not necessarily any high-level announcements from the Integrity Council, but continued momentum as those core carbon principles, as we see programs applying to be considered by the Integrity Council, and as we see assessment of those programs and methodologies. And we expect soon, perhaps by the end of this year, perhaps early next year, to be seeing those core carbon principles reflected in labels in the market that would identify high quality credits. So on the integrity side, I think lots going on in terms of the voluntary carbon market. And then on the innovation side, we've been very involved in at C2S in the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is the effort spearheaded by John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate of the U.S., as well as by the Bezos Earth Fund and Rockefeller Foundation. And there will be a launch on December 3rd of this next phase of the Energy Transition Accelerator, which was first announced at COP27. I think we also expect, so the Energy Transition Accelerator is an effort to scale up finance into accelerating the transition in the power sector in developing countries. And that will be part of a number of other efforts really focused on how to accelerate that transition, accelerate the transition away from coal and other fossil fuels and into renewable power and other clean forms of electricity. So that will be a focus, I think, that we'll see outside the main negotiations. And then we expect as well in the carbon crediting world to see some progress on the LEAF Coalition, which was launched back in 2021, focused on mobilizing finance for tropical forest protection. So that's on the voluntary carbon market, again, outside of the formal, certainly outside of the negotiations, but also something that has been a major focus of lots of folks who will be at COP. Let me then finally, before we move to questions, share a couple of thoughts about the U.S. and how the U.S. comes into this COP, both in terms of its own domestic implementation, but also in terms of its relation with China. And Nora, I think we can probably take down the slides for this. So obviously, as folks on the call will be familiar with, the U.S. comes in, not only having passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA a year and 2 years ago, respectively, but also now, I think, having made significant headway in implementing them. So I think the U.S. comes in with a fair amount of a tailwind and momentum into the COP, being able to demonstrate not only the commitment to passing those pieces of legislation, but also now to implementing them. As you all will be aware, the U.S. Treasury has developed and released a number of important pieces of guidance in terms of implementing the IRA. We see the investments already happening in terms of announcements and commitments by companies to be investing in the clean energy supply chain, to be making major investments in renewable energy and clean electricity, taking advantage of the tax credits offered by the IRA and the additional and the grant funding and other funding provided by IIJA. We see the Department of Energy moving ahead with deploying the very large sums of capital in the IIJA and IRA towards clean energy, announcing the hydrogen hubs several weeks ago, and really ramping up their internal capacity to get the funding out the door. So I think the U.S. comes in able to tell a very good story so far of its implementation of IRA and IIJA. Of course, there's still a huge amount to be done. And one of the important stories, of course, and one of the important threads there will be the way in which the IRA and IIJA can demonstrate at a practical level on the ground throughout the U.S. and red states and blue states alike, the low carbon economic or the economic opportunities from the low carbon transition, and do that in a way that builds durable political support for climate action in the U.S., which I know lots of folks internationally are focused on. The last thing I'll just mention, Kaveh referred to the U.S.-China announcement a few days ago, both the high-level, the results of the high-level talks at the APEC summit, but also more importantly, the Sunnylands statement that John Kerry and Jie Shenhua released. I think the coming out of APEC and the Sunnylands statement, we see a couple of things that are particularly notable. One is the overall tone of that relationship, I think, has warmed again significantly relative to where it has been the last couple of years. In a sense, I think since the Shanghai communique that the US and China issued jointly back in 2021, we had seen a pretty significant decline in the overall relationship between US and China, not on climate specifically, but in the broader tensions in that relationship. And I think many observers saw a bit more conciliatory approach, maybe, of both countries, in particular of President Xi at APEC, which sets the tone for the overall relationship. And then I think if we look at the Sunnylands statement in particular, that again was significant movement back towards the kind of collaboration we need to see from the US and China on climate. All of you are aware that the really healthy collaboration and cooperation, joint action between the US and China under the Obama administration from 2013 up until 2015 was really critical to the success of the Paris Agreement, and that G2 relationship will continue to be really critical going forward. I think the highlights of the Sunnyland statement in particular, one is the focus on the global stocktake and the value of the global stocktake in identifying a handful of high-level political signals, including on the clean energy transition, on methane, on carbon forest sinks and finance. I think that's really important to see the US and China embracing that theory of the case around the global stocktake, which aligns very much with, I think, what Kaveh described earlier. And then in particular, the focus of the Sunnyland statement on specific statements, specific actions and commitments around the clean energy transition and the tripling of renewables capacity, which of course is a high-level focus of the COP presidency, as Kaveh mentioned. The framing of that pledge as well in a way that is linked up to the phase out of fossil fuels, even if that wasn't an explicit commitment, the way that the framing was put in that Sunnyland statement about tripling renewables in a way that is expected to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, I think was very important. And then the emphasis on methane and practical actions. We need to see much more in that area, but I think the Sunnyland statement was a step in the right direction. So with that, let me close and let's turn to questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Nat. So just feel free to raise your virtual hand. Questions. Rachel, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for doing this and for taking my question. I wanted to ask, I believe we don't know at this point whether or not President Biden is planning to attend. Can you speak to, whether him attending or not, matters in terms of the US's standing on this issue in the global stage? And if so, what message it sends either way if he does or does not attend?
Sure. I can say something quickly and then Kaveh should join in as well. But I'll just say, I think this is where having somebody with the stature of John Kerry as the special presidential envoy on climate is really important, right? Kerry brings both the stature of a former, of a former Secretary of State, of course, and presidential nominee of this party, somebody with really deep connections and respect around the world, but also somebody who, by virtue of his particular position and the fact that he has a direct line to the president, reports to the president, I think is seen as speaking for the Biden administration on this and speaking for the president in particular. So I think the presence of John Kerry and his the vigor that he brings to this area and the commitment he brings, I think really ameliorates any particular concerns around whether or not, you know, the Biden administration is all in. I think that Kerry's presence there will certainly convey that. But Kaveh, I don't know if you want anything to add.
Nothing really to add. I know the COP28 presidency is hoping that there'll be a very large number of leaders present, but I don't know what the latest list is, and often other priorities come in. So, you know, fully agree with Nat that, you know, Secretary Kerry has that gravitas and commitment to represent the US fully.
Great. Abigail, congrats.
Hi there. Thanks for doing this. Abigail with Inside EPA. I just was wondering if you could dive a bit more into what kind of language around fossils you expect might be in the final decision documents at COP28. Specifically, I'm curious about whether you think it's likely that a decision would use terms like phase down or phase out, whether you think that's the direction we're going, or whether maybe there's potential for something a bit more creative, especially since the Sunnylands Agreement didn't explicitly mention that kind of phase out. Thank you.
I can come in on this, Nat. So I think it's a great question. If you look at the official positions of the US and the G7, also the European Union, they specifically talk about phase out of unabated. So I think we're in the energy transition, there's going to be a couple of things to look for. One is, do we land this signal of tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency by 2030? That's one thing. And I think the other thing to watch out for is there going to be a reference to either phase out or phase down. So that's going to be another area. And then the question of whether there's going to be a reference to unabated or not. In my view, if you're going to get any kind of phase down or phase out language, the word unabated is going to have to appear in there, because it just won't be politically possible, but also goes against the science not to have abatement. The question is what level of abatement. But I think it's possible to come out of this COP with as a clear signal committing to a global target of tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency by 2030, but also having phase out of unabated. It's interesting, if you look at the presidency vision in their letters, they talk about imagining working towards a world that's free of fossil fuels by 2050. But then later in the letter, they talk about phasing down of unabated. I mean, to me, a world free of unabated fossil fuels by 2050 amounts to a phase out of unabated. So I think it's all to play for, but it's creative language may come in. I think it's interesting that the US-China statement talks about a substitution of fossil fuels by renewable energy. So I think creative language may come in, but I definitely think it's still possible to land a phase out signal.
I'll just add really quickly before we go to the next. Thanks, Abigail, for the question. And of course, agree with everything that Kaveh said. I would also add, just underscore a couple of points. One is, as Kaveh said in the beginning, and from our perspective, the really important thing from the global stocktake is that whatever we come out with in terms of high-level political signals, that there's an actionable agenda going forward that links that to what needs to happen in 2024, and that links that to the next round of NDCs in 2025. I think one thing we've seen in the past is that you can have a lot of focus on the specific language, but no focus on what it means to take it forward. And so we'd like to see, we think it's very important that you see the kind of focus on, okay, what does it mean to take it forward? What if we think about the high-level political signals, make sure that they are concrete and specific enough, like tripling renewables, that you can measure it and that you can follow up on it. And so that, I think, is really important, and that we see that kind of measurable and concrete, actionable language and the ties to what it means going forward. I was also going to make the same point that Kaveh did, so I'll just underscore it and double click on it. You know, I think if you think about what does creative language look like, I think that language in the Sunnyland statement is an example, right? You're right, Abigail, that there was not a firm commitment in there or some sort of pledge around fossil fuel phase out, but it wasn't accidental that there was a link drawn between tripling renewables and the substitution for fossil. And I think that's the way that, you know, frankly, I think we're going to make political progress on this. I think you need a vision that talks about the expansion of clean energy and renewable energy in ways that can meet the real needs of energy poor countries and meet the energy access needs. And you need to lead with that. And then you can talk about how that makes possible the substitution for fossil and the phase out or phase down of fossil. So I think that language in the G2 was artful in that way and points the way towards linking up how the expansion of renewables can lead to phasing out the unabated fossil. Thanks.
So Minnie, you can go next.
Hi, just a quick one. You spoke about finance. Certainly what, we're hearing from many quarters is that finance for both mitigation and particularly adaptation remains woefully inadequate. So I wanted to just get your sense of whether you expect concrete finance announcements, with figures attached to it, either from the multilateral development banks or from any other sources. And if not, what kind of political signal, would that send? Thanks.
Thanks, Samini. I think that's a good question. I mean, finance is at the heart of every COP for understandable and very valid reasons. So one good piece of news is that I understand that the rich countries that committed to delivering the 100 billion by 2020 will be able to say at the COP that they have reached that level. So although it's going to be 3 years late, my understanding is that that's fairly clear. So I think that's one good piece of news. The other issue that's going to be on the table is, of course, in Glasgow, there was an agreement to double adaptation finance. So that's going to be in the spotlight to try to track whether progress has been made against that and to sort of double down on that. But the other thing that's important to understand is that there's ongoing negotiations on what's called the new collective quantified goal on finance. And this is essentially the finance goal that is going to be the successor to the 100 billion. That has a number of components. So one is the sort of what will be the new 100 billion, what will be that figure going forwards beyond 2025. But there's other components in that mandate that are important, including the so-called Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which talks about aligning global finance flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what that article really talks to is the sort of shifting climate finance and investment to the trillions, not just the 100 billion. So the 100 billion is important as a symbolic thing, particularly for the most vulnerable countries. But as we know, the figures of investment needed run to the trillions. And the latest that I've seen is that developing countries will need something like 4 trillion per annum in terms of climate action. So clearly that's not going to come only from public sector finance in developed countries. So this question about realigning global financial flows to be consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement will be really front and center. And one of the live issues for the global stocktake is trying to find that balance between the specific commitments that are or obligations that countries have vis-a-vis climate finance, but also this sort of wider perspective of making financial flows move. So I think it's going to be important, but the real landing zone may actually be COP29, where the mandate of the new collective quantified goal is due to mature. So we could imagine that COP28 sets out the vision and the ambition for what the world wants to do on the energy transition and adaptation. And then COP29 will need to really think about the investment and climate finance package. The last thing I would add is that the tripling of renewable energy target, there's no country in the world that doesn't want to increase its renewables, but developing countries understandably want to know how they can do that. So we have put forward that along with that tripling of renewables in terms of the capacity, you also have to have a tripling of global investment in renewables to make that happen. And that's not a number that's picked out of the air. It's based on work of Irina and others. Thanks. I don't know, Nat, if you wanted to say something also about finance, innovative sources like finance flowing from the voluntary carbon market, for example, is
yeah, just very briefly, and Samini, thanks for the question. I think I think the only additional point I would make is, given the numbers that Kaveh discussed, and I think that we're all familiar with, about the enormous needs for mobilizing capital, I think I look at this as something where we need every channel we can. And so it's, all the things that Kaveh discussed about the role of finance in the negotiations and the new goal and so on is really critical. Also, the role of multilateral banks, as you mentioned, Samini, and the prospect of World Bank reform, and of mobilizing more through the world through multilateral banks. And then there is, as I mentioned, the voluntary carbon market, which is a small piece, but every piece counts, right? And so if we can scale up, if we can meet the vision for the voluntary carbon market in particular, of scaling that up, ensuring its integrity and scaling it up to the tens of billions of dollars a year, that would be an important additional source, even though it's still, it's orders of magnitude below the total that we need. We need every source that we can mobilize. So it's not a substitute for public finance. And I think we would certainly say that the US ought to be doing more and bringing more to the table in terms of public finance, but it can be a complement and an additional source of finance. And at this point, as I said, we need everything we can mobilize. And so every source we can is something I think we need to be tapping into.
Great, thanks, Nat. Alejandra, you are next.
Hi, yeah, it's Alejandra. I work at Carbon Pulse, and I just had a couple of questions. So the first one is about nature-based solutions beyond offsetting, so not in the voluntary carbon market sense. In terms of the glass, is ecosystem-based adaptation from the global goal on adaptation something we should be looking out for? Is that being integrated into these discussions? And then secondly, when we speak about just energy transition, last year, the original version of the Bridgetown Initiative, or rather one of the iterated versions of the Bridgetown Initiative, one of the early ones, talked about a climate mitigation trust that would be held within the IMF. Is that live at all whatsoever? It seems to have fallen off a bit.
Now, do you want me?
Why don't you take those? Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll let you come in on the nature-based solutions one, if that's okay. So on the glass, and thanks for those questions, Alejandro. On the global goal on adaptation framework. So, I mean, as you'll be aware, that COP28 is supposed to agree the framework on the global goal on adaptation, and there's been 8 workshops, and actually also an informal meeting that CTS was involved in convening. The report for the glass workshop has now come out, and our view is that while it's helpful, there's still a lot to be done to reach a successful landing zone on this at COP28. So the way forward is still not clear. So to answer your question, yes, it could still be there, but it's not really clear yet where the framework's going to land. So we're actually going to be producing a paper, hopefully in advance of the COP, that we'll try to be sure that we share with you. We also have published a paper that looks at the need for sort of a politically salient guiding star for adaptation, because in our view, adaptation has suffered because it's never really had that visionary goal to bring the world together and to mobilize more action. So again, I'm hoping that Nora can share that paper with you. So that's a partial answer to your question, is that it's really still not clear where things are going to land. And then in terms of the just energy transition, it is vital that there is finance there for the vast majority of countries in the world that are not in the G20 in particular, who would like to do this, but whose emissions don't necessarily matter as much as others, but obviously need the resources. So we, as Nat alluded to, think it's really important that 2024 is an active year where you have this notion of enhanced international cooperation, where countries, the private sector, intergovernmental organizations like IRENA and IEA come together to show the way forward, and beyond just finance, but also really the capacity building and understanding how these things can be taken forward. AOSIS has made a proposal that there should be a series of, the small islands have made a proposal that there should be a series of capacity building events during 2024 to help countries with the formulation of their new NDCs, which I think is an excellent idea. On the specific question of finance, as I say, we think there needs to be a tripling of investment for renewable energies. The MDBs and IFIs need to be involved in that. I think Bridgetown is still live, and the presidency, as one of its visions, has clearly this idea of reforming international climate finance. So that I think there will be a lot of pressure on the MDBs and others to show up and be open to innovation. So I think Bridgetown is still very much on the table. So I hope I answered your question. And then Nat, there was a question to you about, I think, nature-based solutions beyond offsets.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick on that because I know Sarah has her hand up as well. I think, I think in general, we've seen a sea change over the past several years, maybe over the past decade, but especially the last 5 or so years, on how centrally nature-based solutions have become. And I think that's a recognition of course, the importance of nature-based solutions as carbon, or forests and other natural lands as carbon sinks, as stores of existing carbon, but also potential sources for new sequestration, but also the enormous co-benefits that they provide, the importance of biodiversity, the way that they sustain livelihoods, including among local communities and indigenous people. So I think that we'll continue to see a focus on that broadly thematically, and I think you'll see that reflected in sort of the a lot of the focal areas and the priorities of the presidency. I think the particular piece that we'll see in this COP will be linking those issues around nature-based solutions and land use to agriculture, to food and agriculture, and the need for food security and agricultural security in the global South, but doing that in ways that also enhance and complement nature-based solutions. So I think that we'll see that as a main theme in this COP, and I think going forward.
Sarah, you can go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for doing this. I'm curious what role you think carbon removal or carbon capture might play in this COP. The presidency has mentioned it and refers often to the need to reduce emissions, and I think other Gulf states as well. But the US has also emphasized this. And I guess specifically to the question of abated versus unabated, Kaveh, do you see any space for further definition of what that might mean, or to try and limit the role that abatement plays in fossil fuel reductions?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think this will be a central issue. I mean, the way that I look at this is that the notion that the world has to reach net zero emissions by 2050 is now something that's widely accepted. There's differences in view. Some countries think that others should go to net zero earlier, and that others feel that they should go later. But I think there's an acceptance that the world should be net zero as a whole by 2050. What has never really been articulated or agreed is a common vision about what that equilibrium of net zero looks like. So this goes to the heart of your question. So my understanding, and I'm not an expert, I'm not an IPCC author, but all of the pathways, I think, talk about some form of removals for all of the scenarios that are consistent with a 1.5 degree world. So if you're going to be consistent with the science and use the science to speak about the urgency of staying within 1.5, I think you can't ignore the part of the science that says that removals have to be part of that story. The problem is that there's a lot of mistrust around this issue because, as I say, we don't have a common understanding of where that equilibrium lies. I mean, you could have one absurd extreme where you literally have no emissions at all of greenhouse gases, which is literally impossible. And then you have the other extreme where you just carry on as we are now, and everything else, and everything is removed, which is economically and physically probably impossible. So the answer lies somewhere in between. And I think the IPCC in general talks about having a residual role and the importance of abatement in hard to abate sectors. So I think that's what we need to move towards. But what I understand is that even for that limited amount of carbon removals, the world is way off track in terms of the investment it needs to accelerate the sort of bringing online even that minimum level. So if we are serious about 1.5, we can't pretend that removals are not part of the story. We need to have that honest debate about where that lies. But I think, Nat may have some views on this as well.
No, thanks, Sarah, for the question. I would just underscore what Kaveh said, right? Every pathway that we see towards 1.5 or even frankly well below 2 has a role in some ways for some form of carbon removal technologies. And there's a mix of those, right? And that might be nature-based, it might be engineered carbon removal, certainly carbon capture and storage on, as an end of pipe, which is not formally removal, but plays a role in reducing emissions. I think we need, this is an area where we need all the technologies we can get, and we need to be making investments in innovation now so we understand, so we're in a position to use the technologies that we'll be able to have, and we understand what will work and what won't. And none of that takes away from the urgency of accelerating reductions in emissions through phasing out fossil fuels, through dramatically expanding the use of clean energy and zero carbon energy and so on. So I think exactly as Kaveh said, and I think we know that carbon removal and sequestration needs to be a complement to the actions that we take to reduce emissions directly. But it's going to be an important complement, because as Kaveh said, what the science and the modeling tell us is that if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we're almost surely going to need some of these technologies. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think Kaveh put it very well. And I think if we think about what the science says and what the modeling says, I think that's where we need to focus our efforts in being clear on the breadth of technologies and the breadth of approaches that we need to pursue and innovate and invest in if we're going to meet our goals.
Thanks, Nat. Does anyone else have any other questions they would like to ask right now? Rachel, go ahead.
I have another one if nobody has anything else. I feel like we've talked a lot and I've heard a lot about this, idea of tripling renewables. But it's my understanding that G20 already said they wanted to pursue a global tripling of renewables earlier in the year. So I guess I'm wondering what more you guys are looking for on that front. Is it just more countries, or is it, individual goals instead of collective? Like, what exactly is there to do, because they've already got that agreement?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, it's definitely a good sign that the G20 reached that agreement, and particularly that it was under the leadership of India. And as Nat said, also reinforced in the US-China statement. It's also in the statement of the G7. It's the the position of the European Union as well. So I think all of that's important, but it's very important to land this in the formal outcome of the COP. So without getting too technical, the COP can take formal decisions which are negotiated and agreed by consensus of all 197 or so countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement. And the reason that that's important is that it really grounds it in the process. So there's a level of follow-up and accountability to make sure that there's follow-through on making that promise. And again, the G20 is very important, particularly I think it's responsible for something like 80% of global emissions. But the rest of the world wants to be part of this as well, including vulnerable countries. So there's a number of co-benefits to transitioning to renewables, including pollution reduction and also energy security. So many of the world's most climate vulnerable countries and poorest countries are also at the end of various supply chains and suffer the most from shocks. And many of them actually spend huge amounts of their GDP on fossil fuel imports and subsidies. So I think it's really important that it lands in the formal outcome of the COP. So it's great that the G20 were there, because we could hope that they would follow through on that and would be championing this. But seeing it in the COP outcome is not so straightforward. So we may see some pushback there for various reasons. But
yeah, I'll also add, because Rachel, it's a good question, and I want to build on what Kaveh said. If we pull back a little bit, and maybe this is a good place to be ending on, but if we pull back and we ask, well, what is this COP? What are we looking to get out of this COP, right? Where does this COP fit in the larger arc of the UN negotiations and the Paris Agreement? The really critical piece is this COP is the first global stock take. And so what we're answering in this COP is, how will the global stock take be part of that critical cycle of ambition, that 5-year cycle of ambition that's built into the Paris Agreement? I talked with many of you during Paris. I'm sure Kaveh did as well. We all said in Paris in December 2015, we know that the initial targets, the initial pledges and commitments that countries make will not be ambitious enough. We know that the next round won't be ambitious enough, and we need to build into the agreement a cycle that continues to ratchet up ambition over time. That's written several places into the agreement, as you know, in different ways. And the global stocktake is a critical part of that. It's an opportunity not just to assess where we are and where the emissions trajectory of the globe is relative to the trajectory it needs to be well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. But it's also an opportunity in particular to translate that learning into the specific steps we need to close that gap, to correct the trajectory, and to ratchet up ambition over time. And that's where having a handful of specific high-level signals that are connected to action in 2024 and connected to the NDCs in 2025 is really critical. And so from that point of view, Rachel, I think the tripling of renewables goal is something that I think we and others have been pushing for as an example of that kind of concrete high-level political outcome. And the fact that you saw it reflected in the G20 is part of the buildup to the COP and to the COP outcome, and the buildup of political support that we want to see carry through into the COP, as Kaveh said, rather than a substitute for what the UN might do. So this is a critical moment to see, can we deliver? Can the UN deliver on the promise of the global stocktake and the kind of momentum and support we've seen for the tripling renewable goal and other goals on methane and so on from the G20, from the G2, from others, I think is a really important signal that hopefully we can carry through that momentum into the COP itself. And Nora, that's probably a good place to end, because I know we're almost at the hour. I know you're going to wrap us up. Let me just say first quickly, thank you to all of you for joining, and thanks as well. And anticipating folks watching this online, we thank folks as well. But thank you for joining today. And Nora, let me turn it back to you, unless Kaveh, you want to say anything in close.
Great, thanks, Nat. We have dropped some resources in the chat for about different reports we have about COP, and then our web page dedicated to COP28 as well. And my contact info is also in the chat in case you'd like to follow up with Nat or Kaveh on any of these topics. And just want to echo that, Nat's thanks for joining today, and hope that everyone has a happy Thanksgiving. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. See you in Dubai.